Welcome, and thank you for finding your way here. If you'd like to join me on this quiet journey, I'd love to have you subscribe. And please share with me any topics you'd most like me to explore. The beach is one of my favorite places. The sand and the sun seem to feed my soul. This story is one of deserts and the daughters that live there. I hope you enjoy this telling. This is a quiet space, one made for soft voices and overlooked stories. Whether you sleep through every word or stay with me until the end, let's start to get relaxed. Turn on your fan, put on your eye mask, settle into your favorite weighted blanket, and close your eyes. Let's begin by taking 2 long, deep breaths, and then sigh them out. While we'll start to switch your brain into a more relaxed state. Clear your mind and just listen to my words. The desert is no place for the faint of heart or the unprepared. And yet, for centuries, women have carved out lives in these sun-scorched landscapes, mastering rhythms that modern conveniences have all but erased. Among the shifting dunes and rocky escarpments, desert life demanded adaptability, endurance, and an intimate understanding of nature's moods. The Bedouin women of the Arabian deserts, wrapped in flowing garments that shielded them from the blistering sun and sand-laced wind, became keepers of knowledge passed down through oral tradition. Their daily rhythms revolved around the rising and setting of the sun, milking goats at dawn, baking flatbreads over hot stones, weaving goat hair into tents sturdy enough to withstand sandstorms, and preparing herbal remedies from the sparse but potent flora around them. In North Africa, Berber women held economic power as traders and artisans. Their silver jewelry and indigo-dyed fabrics weren't just adornments, they told stories, signified status, and protected wearers through symbolism older than most kingdoms. Their tattoos and textiles, rich with geometric motifs, offered a kind of survival map, encoded in pigment and thread. The Nabatean women of Petra, nestled among the rose-red cliffs of present-day Jordan, lived at a crossroads of commerce. While little direct evidence survives of their individual lives, the architectural wonders they helped sustain cisterns, granaries, sacred space dell of a society that understood scarcity and reverenced water as sacred. Nabatean society relied on women's labor, knowledge, and adaptability to maintain its desert citadel. To survive in these landscapes wasn't simply to endure, but to live in rhythm with extremes. These women didn't conquer the desert, they partnered with it, listening to the language of wind, sky, and stone. And in doing so, they created a legacy of quiet strength written not on parchment, but in the very grains of sand they walked upon. Daily life began not with the rooster's crow, but with the gentle hush of wind over dunes. Women rose early, their tasks mapped not by clocks, but by the shifting of shadows. Morning meant milking goats, tending small fires, grinding grain between stones worn smooth by generations. Everything moved at the pace of the land. Camels were watered before the children, and prayers sent skyward before the bread had risen. Children were wrapped in wool against both the cold of morning and the heat to come. Homes were not statictants of woven goat hair, could be collapsed and carried within an hour, nomadism dictated by grazing patterns and the moods of the sky. Clothing was light and layered, woven from wool or linen to both insulate and protect. Meals were simple dates, flatbread, lentil sand, shared communally. Music and storytelling weren't luxuries, they were memory, keepers, ways to pass the long hours, and teach values around fires flickering with heat and history. Despite the hardships, or perhaps because of them, these communities held fast to customs that celebrated endurance, grace, and hospitality. Water, the most sacred resource of all, became the fulcrum upon which life balanced. Springs were rare blessings, often tucked in craggy rock or nestled at the base of wadis. Women often trekked miles before dawn, clay jars on hips or heads, navigating paths known only by foot feel and family lore. They followed stars, wind shifts, and the murmurs of the land to find it. And when they did, they rationed it with astonishing care. Every drop counted. Ingenious systems arose. In Petra, the Nabateans carved channels and cisterns into sandstone, capturing rainwater and storing it in underground chambers that stayed cool through blistering heat. In North Africa, Berber women passed down the art of fog harvesting, using fine mesh nets strung between trees to catch vapor and funnel it into jars below. Some desert homes had subterranean cooling tunnels or qanat systems, which directed groundwater toward living quarters without losing it to the sun. Bathing wasn't an everyday luxury, but smoke from burning myrrh or sweet herbs offered a ritual of cleansing, even when water was scarce. Scent became sacrament. Grace clung to them, not in spite of the dust, but because of it. Dignity was maintained not with mirrors or silk, but with braided hair and eyes that had seen seasons turn sand to bloom. If you're starting to feel drowsy, you're in good company. The desert teaches you to slow down, to breathe with intention, to move not with urgency but with purpose. The kind of purpose that understands how strength can be both soft and enduring, like sleep settling into your bones after a long, wind-blown day. A camel isn't just a beast of burden, it's the lifeline, the pantry, and occasionally the pillow. Women knew their camels like sisters. Which one was fussy? Which one was a wanderer? Which one gave milk like velveter, silk-hand? Which one tolerated a child riding side, saddle through scorching wind? They sang to them, coaxed them, and healed them with poultices of desert herbs and ancient knowing. A well-loved camel didn't just carry water. She carried stories, dreams, and sometimes, when night fell soft, the weight of a woman too tired to stand. Speaking of households, those weren't built with bricks or beams. A nomadic tent was equal parts architecture and inheritance. Women didn't merely pitch camp, they conjured havens from goat hair and memory. Panels were woven tight to resist rain and breathe through heat. Rugs cushioned the floor like petals dropped in sand. Even the angle of the tent flap was an act of intention, welcoming the wind or shielding the sacred. Domesticity, in the desert, wasn't confined. It moved, it adapted, and it knew when to rest. Cooking was an invocation, not a recipe card in sight, just wisdom stored behind the eyes. A pinch of dried fenugreek, a seed tucked into a child's palm. Flatbread rolled and slapped onto hot stones. Goat meat simmered until it whispered secrets. There was no ceremony, and yet every meal was sacred. If the fire was lit, the camp had a soul. Hospitality wasn't a nicety, it was law. A guest was fed, watered, shaded, and if they stayed long enough, folded into the fabric of the family, even if it meant the hosts ate less. This was the domain of women. Their labor invisible only to the untrained eye, their pride kneaded into every loaf. There was power in generosity, especially the kind that cost you something. If the desert taught women to preserve water like gold, it also taught them to preserve spirit like flame. In these wide, empty spaces where sound barely carried, faith traveled like smoke, persistent and clinging to everything. Before the rise of gods with names and temples with gates, desert women worshipped sky and sand. They knelt in the dust and felt something sacred pulse beneath their palms. Stars were guides, yes, but also gods. The moon marked time, and fire was a mouthpiece for the divine. Then came formal religion, Zoroastrian flames in Persia, Jewish song through Sinai winds, Christian hermits cloistered in Egyptian stone, Muslim prayers carried on desert breath. Women were not always inscribed in the scriptures, but they were always there, tending fires, humming verses, weaving myth into lullaby. Some became mystics, others midwives of belief. They carried amulets and verses in the hems of their robes, herbs tucked beside prayers. They built faith with their hands, their hips, and their hush. Desert faith was embodied. Grinding grain became prayer. Braiding hair was a ritual of care. sweeping the tent threshold at dusk, a benediction. The divine didn't demand cathedrals, it required attention. A sun-bleached rock would do just fine. And when the sun dipped low and cast the land in long shadows, the desert silence turned holy. Women leaned into it. They listened for something older than scripture and more honest than doctrine. Their faith wasn't loud, it didn't posture. It sat with you in the sand until you softened. Whether animist or Abrahamic, these women poured spirit into soil. The desert mothers whispered prayers into cave walls. Bedouin women recited myths that slipped between lines of sacred text. Muslim women lifted water to guests with the same reverence they gave to ablution. Jewish matriarchs bore lineage beneath tents, so thin you could see starlight through the weave. They made faith tactile, not always orthodox, often inconvenient, but deeply, unmistakably rooted. Each act of daily life was a sacrament: sweeping, stitching, lighting a lamp. Whispered offerings, repeated devotions, and from these rhythms rose mystics. Some were Sufi, some unnamed. They spun not in public but in the heart. They didn't need spectacle, they had stillness. They embroidered revelations and sang them into daughters' hair. Their rituals lived in courtyards and kitchens. Their altars were sometimes just a quiet corner with a cracked bowl of dates and a prayer. In a world that favors volume, these women chose depth. Their holiness didn't shimmer, it anchored. And under a desert sky scattered with stars, they weren't seeking heaven. They were sinking into the sacred already beneath their feet. And perhaps, as you drift deeper into rest, you might feel that too. That something sacred isn't above or beyond, it's curled in your breath, resting in your chest, waiting for the hush to be heard. Among them were Sufi women seekers, not of spectacle, but of stillness. While their male counterparts spun and chanted beneath wide skies, some women turned inward, tracing a quieter path to the divine. They found sanctity in soft, repetitive motions, kneading dough, turning prayer beads, whispering breath, prayers that echoed not across walls but lifetimes. In shaded courtyards and secluded alcoves, they practiced a luminous solitude. They didn't proclaim revelations, they embroidered them into fabric, etched them in henna, and cradled them in lullabies. Their sanctuaries were not cathedrals, but places where jasmine vines climbed worn stone, and silence was the holiest sound. In a world that prized noise, they made hush into power. They didn't seek to be seen, they sought to see, not to speak, but to listen, not to shine, but to glow. Their hearts moved like compasses pointing not just toward heaven, but to the sacred pulse beneath their very feet. Under starlit skies, their spirits floated gently like breath, like smoke, like the hush just before sleep. Long before doctrine walked on two legs and claimed names, there were goddesses, sculpted from clay, whispered to in the dark, carried in the curve of a hip or the ache of a prayer. In the desert, survival itself was divine birth, blood, harvest, and hush, all held in the same open hand. These weren't fragile, flower-crowned deities. No, they were sun-bronzed, dust-wrapped, and grit-backed, less harp, more henna. Think date palms and goat's milk, not golden thrones. From Tanit of Carthage, a fierce mother of war, and Wumto, Egypt's Hathor, whose gifts were love, music, and the star-strewn milk of the sky, the feminine divine was as practical as she was powerful. Rituals weren't reserved for temples. They bloomed in riverbeds, in bread ovens, in the curves of pregnant bellies painted with henna spirals. Women sang their mothers' names into firelight, danced barefoot to beckon rain, shaped loaves into symbols older than memory. Whether private or public, loud or whispered, these rites reclaimed power. They said, "The body is not burden, it is a vessel, not shameful, but sacred." And though monotheism swept in like a sandstorm, the goddess did not vanish. She changed names, switched altars, shifted language, But the old songs? They still hummed beneath the new ones, tucked into the marrow of women who knew that surviving another day in the desert was its own kind of prayer. So, as you rest stiff, your eyes grow heavy, imagine them, women singing to the stars, offering a breath to the wind, steeping herbs by moonlight. The fire burns low now, the goddess listens still. Ingenuity bloomed where rain refused. In the clefts of dry rock and beneath relentless skies, desert women invented water from air, shelter from thread, and sanctuary from rhythm. Nabatean women etched sandstone into cisterns, turning cliff faces into echo chambers for rain. Berber women, ever attuned to the subtleties of air and sky, strung fine mesh nets to trap fog-morning mist captured like breath in a jar. In place of plumbing, they shaped the land itself, carving underground tunnels that whispered cool drafts into parched homes. Water wasn't merely essential, it was sacred. Even cleansing took on new forms. With myrrh smoke curling in the corners of tents, scent became a stand-in for streams. Grace was a practiced ritual, not despite the dust, but because of it braided hair, lined hands, and eyes that could chart the seasons in a single breeze. And as the midday sun struck down with no mercy, movement did not see sight, simply softened. Women moved through the heat, not in haste, but in harmony. Survival here was not about domination. It was choreography, resistance whispered. Wisdom passed hand to hand in woven baskets and lullabies that lulled more than babies to sleep. As evening stretched long shadows across the sand, the silence of the desert became its own sanctuary. Spirituality here was not pageantry, but presence. These were women who held space for the sacred without ever raising their voices. Whether lighting a lamp or sweeping sand from a doorway, they prayed with their hands. Organized religion eventually rode in on camelback and parchment Zoroastrian fire, Hebrew psalms, Christian chants, and Islamic prayers. But long before temples or texts, women knelt in the sand, eyes skyward, hands earth-stained. They carried beliefs not in books but in bracelets, herbs, and stories, passed from grandmother to granddaughter. Some of these women became mystics, not through asceticism but through repetition. The desert mothers carved silence into stone. Bedouin women turned memory into melody. And Sufi seekers wove spirituality into daily acts, kneading, beating, breathing. Their solitude wasn't barren, it was radiant. They didn't need altars, they had courtyards. Their rituals weren't sermons, they were songs. In a world that demanded spectacle, these women wielded quiet like a torch, not to be seen, but to see. And beneath stars so bright, they silenced thought. They turned inward compasses, not aimed at the heavens, but attuned to the sacred just beneath the surface. Even the homes they built mirrored this ethos, goat hair and camel wool sewn into tents that could collapse in an hour yet shelter for years, rugs layered not just for warmth but memory, brass pots hanging like ornaments, baskets stuffed with medicine, memory, and meaning. These were mobile sanctuaries, designed by hands that remembered every stitch. Women tended fire and fermented milk, stitched garments, and told stories that could tether generations to a single patch of earth. They knew the land like scripture wind, root, and omen. They healed, read stars, translated dreams. Even as their homes moved, their presence lingered in the scent of sage, the lull of mortar and pestle, the hush of evening prayer. Let this echo now, Leah, in the quiet rhythm of your video. Not a demand to fall asleep, but an invitation to drift with them through wind and dust, memory and myth, where every soft footstep and whispered story leads toward rest. And from these whispered offerings rose mystics. Among them were Sufi women seekers not of spectacle, but stillness. While their male counterparts spun in open courtyards, arms outstretched to heaven, some women turned inward. They courted the divine through soft repetition, kneading dough, turning beads, whispering breath, prayers that hummed like lullabies across generations. They practiced a solitude that wasn't lonely, but luminous. You wouldn't find their revelations in sermons or scrolls. You'd find them embroidered into hymns, etched in henna, murmured into the ears of sleeping children. Their sanctuaries weren't temples. They were courtyards, kitchens, shaded gardens, where silence spoke volumes, and ritual wove the sacred into the everyday. In a world shouting for attention, these women made quiet their rebellion. They didn't seek to be seen. They sought to see, to listen, to know. Their devotion bloomed in hush steadfast, steady, and strong as stone warmed by centuries of sun. Under starlit skies, their hearts turned like compasses, not always toward some distant deity, but toward the sacred that pulsed beneath their own feet. Nomadic homes weren't places, they were gestures. Goat hair tents stitched with history, dyed with earth and smoke, patched by calloused hands. The walls moved, but the center held. Rugs softened the floor like pages of a worn storybook. Brass pots gleamed like old coins. Every basket held both grain and memory. Women were the memory keepers. They fermented milk, kneaded dough, and stitched garments while recounting lineages, trading proverbs, and passing down remedies whispered in wind. Their knowledge wasn't just practical, it was poetic. They could read a storm by scent, tell a child's fever from the pitch of a breath. They were physicians, philosophers, and cartographers of the unseen. And when the tents were folded and the caravan moved on, the echo of their presence lingered in the scent of sage, the sound of lullabies, the rhythm of pestle and bowl-tapping twilight. In movement, they stitched belonging. In impermanence, they shaped permanence. In these sun-blasted lands, clothing was more than cloth. It was armor, identity, and artistry. A fluttering veil wasn't just modesty, it was a calculus of wind and heat. Indigo robes caught the eye like dusk before the stars. Stitching told secrets. Patterns sang ancestry. Adornment was the language of lineage. Weddings shimmered with silver amulets and bridal faces veiled in textiles that carried a grandmother's thumbprint in every thread. Anklets chimed softly echoes of continuity rather than ornament. Henna swirled in prayers and blessings, stories written on skin in russet ink and floral breath. Beauty wasn't surface level, it was soul deep. In a land where little grew, women cultivated meaning like rare desert blooms. Tattoos carved that meaning permanently. A crescent moon on the forehead, spirals at the wrist, ink from soot or coal biting softly into skin. They weren't decorations. They were declarations of tribe, belief, status, or sorrow. Not fleeting fashion, but memory made visible. Jewelry echoed this legacy. Nose rings weren't mere sparkle, they spoke of marriage, of mourning, of might. Coin necklaces clinked with stories dowels passed down, generations tethered bead by bead. Even earrings held whispers, a promise, a prayer, a path taken and never forgotten. In these harsh places where sun scorches and sand strips away the unessential, women didn't just survive, they announced themselves. This is who I am, this is where I come from, this is what I carry. Not hidden behind veils of propriety, but etched boldly into skin, woven into cloth, and gleaming in the light. In the desert, water is sacred, a resource too precious to squander on vanity. And yet, where the rivers run dry and wells are deep, women have long found ways to remain clean, fragrant, and radiant. Dry washing was more than practical, it was artful. Clay dusts and fine sand served as exfoliants, rubbed over the skin to polish away sweat and grit. Smoke from aromatic resins like frankincense or myrrh was used not only to perfume the body but to cleanse it, drifting through hair and fabric in slow, ritualistic waves. Hair was often wrapped and protected, oiled with pressed seeds or animal fats to maintain softness under the sun's glare. Henna played double duty both as decoration and as a cooling agent. Applied to palms, soles, and even scalps, it offered relief and radiance in equal measure. Beauty in the desert was not an afterthought, it was resilience made graceful. Even when water was a luxury, self-care was not abandoned. It simply adapted, elegant and unbothered, like the women themselves. In times of upheaval, when empires clashed and caravans scattered, it was often women who held memory in their hands like a string of prayer beads. In desert societies where written records were scarce and winds could scatter paper like dust, oral tradition was the anchor. Women became the vessels for history, humming lullabies that masked stories of past migrations, wars, and miracles. Around campfires and in the hush of night shelters, they told tales of resilience, passed down like precious heirlooms. These stories carried not just facts, but feelings, grief braided with grit, tenderness laced with warnings. They became walking libraries, remembering who came before, what was lost, and how to endure. In some nomadic tribes, young girls were taught not only how to cook or sew, but how to recite entire lineages and legends. Their knowledge was the map when all else was gone. If the men were taken or lost in battle, these women carried the identity of the tribe forward in their words, and so, in the face of erasure, they narrated survival. When raids struck or invaders swept through, it was the women who bundled the children in cloth and hid them beneath camel saddles. They whispered warnings, sent coded messages in song or embroidery, and moved like the winsolent, fast, unseen. In Berber and Bedouin communities, matriarchs would lead fleeing families to safety, sometimes walking for days across barren expanses with little food or rest. Their role was not just in tending the hearth, but guarding its flame. Protection extended beyond the physical. Women became the emotional strongholds during chaos. Elders who could not travel were comforted by daughters and granddaughters who refused to leave them behind. Infants were born mid-flight, into makeshift tents or caves, cradled by trembling hands that had not lost their gentleness, despite the violence surrounding them. And even in terror, rituals of care persisted, a song, a clean cloth, a braid redone. Out of war zones and into refugee encampments, women became architects of new life. They used scraps of fabric to make bedding, turned abandoned tins into cooking pots, and crafted temporary schools with nothing but intention and a patch of shade. Whether in ancient desert migrations or modern displacement camps, it was women who gathered the broken pieces and said, "This will be our home, for now." Community emerged not from buildings, but from shared labor, shared grief, and shared laughter. Women organized food lines, created spaces for prayer, taught children letters using sticks in the sand. Some formed councils, ad hoc governments of empathy, resolving disputes, assigning duties, protecting the vulnerable. Survival was reimagined, not as mere endurance, but as reinvention. Stories of betrayal, bravery, and resilience were not confined to epic poetry, they were lived daily. A mother who turned back into a burning village for a daughter. A sister who offered herself in negotiation to spare others. A grandmother who sat unmoved during interrogation, her silence more defiant than speech. These were not heroines of myth, but of moment. And each act, however small, formed part of a larger testament, that in deserts scorched by war and history, women did not merely survive, they became the oasis. Love, too, found a way to bloom amid the austerity of sand and stone. Desert love poetry, passed from tongue to ear, often came from the hearts of women who had little else to give but words. These were not just laments of longing, but declarations of independence and fierce devotion. Nabatean inscriptions scratched into rock walls, and oral poems from Tuareg women capture the ache of separation, the thrill of a secret glance, the sorrow of a lover given to another. Love, in the dunes, was not always public, but it was always potent. In some tribes, women's poetry was prized and performed in gatherings, a rare instance where their voices led the room. These verses often encoded romantic yearning within metaphors of desert life. My heart waits like the well after rain, or your name is the wind that stirs my veil. Whether sung over cooking fires or whispered beneath veils, this poetry kept emotional lives vivid, even when outward expression was curtailed. Courtship followed ritual, shaped by practicality and poetry in equal parts. Marriage was often arranged, but that didn't mean it lacked affection. Symbolic gestures like the gifting of water, shade, or shelter spoke louder than declarations. Some Berber tribes placed great importance on symbolic adornments during betrothal, such as fibulae or woven textiles, meant to show both affection and status. In other cultures, dances, songs, or the sharing of meals became quiet ways to signal intent. But not every love story fit neatly into cultural norms. Forbidden lovers met at night, beneath stars that bore silent witness. Messages were tucked into baskets, encoded into beadwork, or hummed in shared lullabies. When letters could not be written, embroidery became its own form of prose. The thread spoke of longing, of stolen touches, of futures imagined in the firelight. Love, constrained by tradition, grew clever and careful. And then there was romance shaped by necessity, what one might call the poetry of survival. Hospitality in the desert was sacred, and in it, romance sometimes bloomed. A traveler offered water at a threshold might return again with the excuse of thirst. Eyes met over shared cups, hands brushed during the giving of bread. Generosity became flirtation, and kindness, courtship. In these arid lands, even love had to conserve its resources, but when it came, it was deep and often unforgettable. Long after the poetry of courtship quieted into the rhythms of daily life, love took on new forms braided into rugs, dyed into fabrics, and stitched into every corner of the tent. In the desert, devotion was not just whispered in verse, but woven, cooked, and mended by hand. And so, we drift now from the music of romance to the quiet mastery of the domestic arts. Weaving was more than a domestic task. In the desert, it was an act of survival, artistry, and quiet resilience. Women took the fibers of their environment, goat hair, sheep wool, palm frond sand, turned them into shelter, warmth, and identity. Tent walls were not just utilitarian barriers against sun and sand. They were stories stitched in shadow and color. Patterns passed down through generations told tales of ancestors, victories, losses, and longing. Each rug woven was a portable legacy. They cushioned the hard earth, welcomed travelers, marked sacred spaces for prayer or rest. The rhythm of the loom was a rhythm of life, steady, meditative, anchored. Clothing, too, bore the marks of place and culture. Stitched tunics, layered wraps, and head coverings were designed not just for modesty but for survival in punishing heat and wind. Through thread, women carved beauty into necessity, and in doing so, wove themselves into the fabric of history. But even the most skillfully woven tent needs a hard hand. It was around these modest fires that another art unfolded, the quiet mastery of desert cuisine, where survival met flavor in every grain and spice. If the desert teaches anything, it's how to turn scarcity into flavor. Women in arid climates became master alchemists of preservation and nutrition, crafting rich cuisine from what little the land would yield. Take date syrup, for instance known as dibs, in many Middle Eastern cultures, dark, molasses-like nectar extracted from ripe dates, boiled down slowly under the sun's approving gaze. It was not merely a sweetener, but a staple. It adorned flatbreads, nourished children, and stood in for honey or sugar when both were luxuries. In some tribes, gifting a jar of date syrup was akin to offering gold. Meat, when available, was never wasted. Women salted and sun-dried strips of lamb or camel meat, creating nutrient-dense rations that could last for weeks of travel. These preserved meats weren't just practical, they became comfort food in times of movement and memory. Recipes were passed down through rhythmic chants as fingers folded spices into meat, sealing both flavor and heritage in each bite. Then there was yogurt on anchor in desert kitchens. Fermented in clay pots and often strained into thick labna, it was as versatile as it was vital. Yogurt cooled hot dishes, soothed sunburnt skin, and even found its way into ceremonial offerings. A dollop of yogurt carried the essence of home, especially when that home had no fixed address. Desert women, with their patient hands and sharpened senses, made feasts from frugality, and in doing so, seasoned survival with a dash of grace. From simmering pots to stitched seams, not all inheritance is silver and land. In the desert, the most treasured dowry was often passed not through gold, but through gesture show to salt meat just right, where to pitch a tent against the wind, when to gather herbs under a waxing moon. Mothers taught daughters with side glances and stories tucked between chores. Knowledge wasn't given in lectures. It simmered slowly, like tea over a low fire. A daughter might learn to braid her hair and camel reins on the same afternoon, or be scolded for wasting water with the same intensity as wasting a good proverb. A full pot tells no tales, one grandmother might say, meaning, watch, listen, and don't interrupt when wisdom is being served. This wasn't education as a formal affair, it was osmosis. Little fingers learning by doing, ears catching the rhythm of ritual. A girl might not recall her first lesson in weaving or mixing henna, but by womanhood, the muscle memory of generations pulsed beneath her skin. In these lineages, survival wasn't just about staying alive, it was about passing on the recipe for how. From whispered recipes to woven wisdom, the legacy continued in the careful crafting of talismans and fertility doll objects, where belief and intention were stitched into every fiber. In the stillness of desert evenings, women's hands shaped more than meals or garments, they crafted meaning. Talismans made of beads, bones, or dyed threads were not merely decorative. They were guardians, gifted to brides, hung in tents, or tucked into garments for protection. Fertility dolls, often carved from wood or molded from clay, stood as quiet prayer tokens of hope, continuity, and the sacred cycle of life. These items weren't mass-produced trinkets, but personal works of spiritual intent, passed down like heirlooms, carrying with them generations of whispered blessings and well-worn superstitions. In every knot, stitch, and charm, desert women poured quiet, magic-equal parts tradition, tenderness, and tenacity. Let us not forget that even in the most unforgiving landscapes, women have always found ways to soothe each other, their children, and themselves. In these quiet, timeless rituals, there's a kind of sleep magic I hope wraps around you tonight. From the hush of desert evenings and the soft hush of lullabies, we now turn our gaze to movement, the rhythm of footsteps in sand, the creak of leather saddles, and the quiet strength of women who carried home with them, not in walls, but in memory. Trade routes may have been mapped by men, but it was often women who turned them into lifelines of culture, tradition, and influence. As caravans snaked through sun-bleached sands, women stitched their presence into every transaction, selling spices, weaving textiles, bartering jewelry, and passing along stories that traveled farther than the goods themselves. In desert markets and oasis stops, their voices shaped commerce with quiet authority. A well-placed embroidered pattern or a handful of rare herbs could command more sway than coin. These women were cultural polyglots, long before that was a resume builder. They spoke in dialects, gestures, and glances, negotiating trades and alliances across tribes and territories. Their homes, whether tents or temporary stalls, became crossroads of information, taste, and beauty. The influence they wielded wasn't loud, but it lingered, woven into fabric, tucked into spice pouches, braided into the hair of daughters and travelers alike. In a world defined by movement, desert women gave trade its heartbeat and heritage its voice. And when the stars rose over the dunes and the maps grew soft in the dark, it was often women who knew the way. Female navigators, with sky-bound eyes and memories etched in moonlight, guided their families and caravans by star lore and instinct. They read the winds, the tracks of camels, the whisper of dunes shifting underfoot. What looked like vast emptiness to outsiders was, to them, a well-marked path of signs, songs, and sacred places. Alongside navigation came healing. These women were the keepers of remedies brewed from desert herbs, salves stirred from sand-sheltered roots, and chants whispered over aching limbs. In the flickering half-light of the caravan's rest, they crushed dates with mint to soothe fevers, tied beads of amber to children's ankles, and knew just which flower bloomed only after a storm. Their medicine was part memory, part magic and wholly necessary. They kept the caravans moving and the people within them whole. They were the daughters of spice routes and silk paths, the unsung weavers of trade and tradition. While maps marked borders and men struck deals, women stitched cultures together with every step they took beside laden camels. They bartered not just goods but knowledge, recipes for perfumed oils, patterns for embroidered robes, lullabies sung in dialects only spoken under desert moons. These women knew the scent of saffron before ever seeing it, could weigh cloves in their palms with uncanny precision, and understood the value of silk, not just in drape, but in diplomacy. Through their hands, the silks of the East kissed the wool of the West, and the stories carried with them were embroidered into garments and memory alike. Every marketplace became a whispering place where languages met, and the quiet power of feminine presence left its trace long after the caravans rolled on. Whether a woman stayed behind or joined the caravan often depended less on choice and more on circumstance. Those who remained did so to care for children, elderly kin, livestock, and the fragile threads of daily life that couldn't be packed on a camel. Stability was their domain, and without their constancy, the travelers would have nothing to return to. But not all women stayed. Some journeyed out of necessity, widows with no protectors, healers whose skills were sought in distant camps, or traders in their own right, managing family wares and brokering with a confidence sharpened by scarcity. In many desert cultures, a woman's presence on the road wasn't unusual. It was strategic. The question was never simply who traveled and who didn't, but rather what each role demanded and how both were essential for survival. And while some women anchored the hearth and others charted the dunes, countless stories slipped between the sandstales from the forgotten daughters of the dust, whose footprints faded but whose echoes still linger. They may not have left scrolls or monuments, but mythical desert women carved their place in legacy through legend sorceresses who spoke to stars, warriors cloaked in veils, and matriarchs whose wisdom shaped the wind. Their names may have shifted with the sands, but their echoes remain whispers carried on desert breezes and half-remembered lullabies by the fire. In the Berber oral tradition, stories tell of Tinhinan, the ancestral queen whose bones were found buried with jewelry and strength alike. Was she myth or monarch? No one quite agrees, but they agree she led. In Arabian tales, Layla, the poetess, became the muse of longing, her verses drifting through campfires long after her footsteps vanished. And in the dustier corners of folklore, desert witches were not villains, but keepers of balance, herbalists, dream interpreters, and those who knew when the moon would pull at both tides and tempers. Some figures, like the sand-bound queens of ancient Nubia, were both mythic and real, wielding power not just over a tribe, but over trade, marriage, and the sometimes tenuous truce between oasis clans. Their stories evolved with the telling, embroidered by grandmothers into warnings, comforts, and quiet lessons. Never underestimate a woman who walks barefoot across burning sand. These women, some born of fact and some of firelight tales, remind us that not all history is etched in stone. Some of it is carried in the way we move, the way we protect, the way we love, and in the stories we whisper to keep ourselves whole. In the quiet work of brushes against buried stone, archaeologists have uncovered more than pottery, and bones they've unearthed surprises. Chief among them, evidence that, in many corners of the ancient world, women didn't just tend the hearth, they ruled the roost. Take Çatalhöyük, a Neolithic city in modern-day Turkey, where burial patterns and household artifacts suggest a society with gender parity and, in some rooms, signs of female prominence. There were no grand palaces or male-dominated temples here. Instead, shrines with voluptuous female figurines, walls adorned with birth scenes, and sacred leopards flanking the goddess of life and death suggest that women may have sat at the spiritual and social center of things. Further east, in the Indus Valley, administrative seals, balanced housing layouts, and priestess-like figures hint at a system that may have venerated feminine order. In Africa, Queen Amanirenas of Kush was no myth or statues, inscribed with military victories, stood long before her name filtered into Western awareness. And in what is now Ukraine, the ancient Sredny Stog and Scythian burials show warrior women buried with weapons, horses, and armor. One girl's grave, complete with bow and blade, could have belonged to a figure who once inspired the Amazon legends. Even in the American Southwest, among the ancestral Puebloans, clan structures were often matrilineal inheritance passed through the mother, and property followed the hands of women. In these homes, power didn't shout. It organized, nurtured, and endured. Of course, no archaeologist will tell you a queen rose up just because she left a necklace behind, but where we find homes built around female figures, shared leadership, and ritual reverence for fertility, it doesn't take a leap to wonder. Perhaps history has just been whispering her story all along. In the hush between stars and sand, songs were born not for performance, but for preservation. Lullabies, hummed low in the ear of a child, often carried more than melody. They carried coded messages, family histories, and the soft murmur of resilience. These songs weren't always sung loud or in public. In many desert cultures, women passed down verses quietly, sometimes in the backs of tents, sometimes while grinding grain or nursing under the shade of a palm. They were layered on the surface, tales of gazelles or moonlight, but beneath, subtle instructions, how to behave, whom to trust, what to remember. A lullaby might tell a child of her grandmother's wisdom, wrapped in metaphors about windstorms and fireflies. In regions where reading was forbidden or inaccessible, these songs were the archives. A refrain might echo a political rebellion, a family migration, or a lost love. To outsiders, they were simple tunes. To those in the know, they were encrypted diaries of a people who kept their stories safe in the folds of rhythm and rhyme. Some of these songs linger today, their original meanings long since veiled, but their comfort intact. They are relics of a time when voices were safer than ink and memory more trusted than parchment. And so, a mother sang to her daughter, and the song became a bridge-soft, secret, and strong enough to last for centuries. And then, there were the desert women who didn't sing lullabies, they whispered prophecies. They ground herbs with intention, traced stars with their fingertips, and carried stories not of what was, but what could be. These were the witches, the wise ones, the watchers at the edge of the firelight. In some tribes, they were healers and midwives. In others, they were feared, accused, revered, or all three in the same lifetime. They read signs in cracked earth and shifting winds, and when men saw omens and war cries, these women saw them in birthmarks and bird flight. To call them witches now is to use a borrowed word. What they were, truly, were boundary walkers, between illness and healing, between seen and unseen, between the living and the dead. Prophetesses were not always veiled in mystery. Some stood beside kings, interpreting dreams. Others roamed alone, untethered by marriage or title, speaking truths that echoed long after the sand had swallowed their names. Their visions weren't always of futures, they were warnings wrapped in riddles, insight braided with incense. And then there were the protectors, the ones who buried charms at the thresholds, who stood watch when storms rolled in it with swords, but with songs, with salt circles, with knowing eyes. These women didn't ask to be remembered, they acted, and then disappeared into the dunes, leaving only legend. Call them what you will, but know this: if you ever feel a breeze kiss your cheek when the night is too quiet, perhaps, somewhere, one of them still keeps watch. But not all desert women moved in shadow, some stood tall beneath the sun. For every whispering prophetess, there was a queen who commanded caravans, a shaman who healed across borders, a trader whose ledgers held more power than a prince's sword. And so, we turn our gaze to the matriarchs of the mirage, those who ruled, bartered, and blessed with equal might. Zenobia of Palmyra didn't just ride across the sands, she rode across history with a gaze steady enough to unnerve emperors. In the 3rd century, she ruled a desert kingdom that dared to rival Rome. With intellect sharpened by philosophy and a lineage she claimed descended from Cleopatra herself, Zenobia led with a blend of charm and iron resolve. She expanded her reach from Syria into Egypt, toppling Roman garrisons with strategic brilliance and, rumor has it, impeccable style. Zenobia spoke several languages, hosted salons of scholars, and wore her golden robes like armor. She became a symbol of desert resistance, fierce, but refined, strategic, yet spiritual. Her court was not merely a seat of power, but a sanctuary of culture and female diplomacy. And while the Roman Empire eventually marched her into captivity, her story remained unshackled, lingering in the sands as a legend. Even now, her name stirs like a desert breeze, at dusk subtle, but unrelenting. In her, we glimpse the rare convergence of queen and rebel, beauty and strategy, grace and grit. Zenobia reminds us that even in the most barren of landscapes, a woman can bloom into an empire. Though often overshadowed in the scrolls of formal history, women of the desert were not merely companions on the trade routes, they were sometimes the ones steering them. In many Bedouin and Tuareg communities, women acted as economic stewards, managing the flow of goods, textiles, and livestock while the men navigated terrain, and in some cases, the women were the navigators, guiding caravans with uncanny instinct honed over generations. Clad in indigo veils and silver jewelry that jingled like coins, these women knew the value of both silence and strategy. They arranged trades, bartered spices, and memorized the secret signs of honest merchants. Some led caravans, carrying perfumes, salt, or woven goods from oasis to oasis, reading the dunes like a sacred script. Their leadership wasn't loud, it was learned, inherited, and laced with the authority of those who kept their people fed and thriving. These traders weren't anomalies, they were part of a lineage of logistical brilliance. In matrilineal Tuareg society, for example, women held property and influence, ensuring that even the harshest terrain could not erode their role. They remind us that command can come softly, with a whisper and a ledger, under a wide sky where every grain of sand counts. In the hush of the desert twilight, when the wind holds its breath and shadows stretch long, there lived women who listened to silence as if it were scripture. These were the priestesses of the sand, the mystics of the mirage, keepers of desert rituals too fluid for parchment and too sacred for public tongues. They lit fires at the edge of dunes and read omens in drifting smoke. They brewed infusions from desert blooms and whispered prayers to stars long dead. Some danced barefoot through salt flats to honor forgotten deities, while others fasted beneath new moons to court visions. Their power was not showy, it was shaped by stillness, weathered by wind, and steeped in symbols that only the patient could interpret. In Egypt, some served as chantresses in temple rites, their voices believed to coax favor from gods. In Mesopotamia's fringe lands, women acted as intermediaries between earth and sky, interpreting dreams with a blend of intuition and lunar timing. And scattered through the sands, in tribes whose names are now nearly dust, women drew sigils in the soil and taught young girls that divinity had many faces, and more than a few were feminine. These priestesses didn't wear crowns, but they wore the weight of mystery well. Their knowledge was not always written, but it was carried mother to daughter, mentor to novice, generation to generation, like a song hummed so often it becomes part of the breath. Some ruled from thrones draped in woven gold, others from the center of a marketplace with nothing but a sharp tongue and sharper instinct. But all of them queens, commanders, cunning matriarchs earned their place in the sun-soaked lore of the desert. These were women who didn't just survive the sands, they bent them to their will. In Ethiopia, the legend of the Queen of Sheba echoes through time, a woman who crossed scorched lands bearing riddles and riches. In Arabia, the tales of Zabiba ruler, mentioned in early Islamic texts, suggest a sovereign whose intellect and influence shaped tribal law. And of course, there's Zenobia, Queen of Palmyra, whose name still kicks up dust in history for daring to defy Rome with a cavalry of warriors and wit. But not all queens wore diadems. Some ruled in quieter, waist-raiding silks by moonlight, making alliances over shared wells, or leading families through famine with nothing but foresight and fierce grace. Their palaces were tents, their armies, kin, their strategy, intuition. The desert remembers them, in the rustle of palms, in the echo of wind tunneling through abandoned cities, in the sand-smooth stones that once lined the paths they chose, queens of the dunes. Mothers of empires, unwritten chapters, waiting still. Today's desert daughters carry ancient resilience in their bones, but wield it in new ways. Bedouin rights activists, for instance, walk the tightrope between tradition and transformation. They advocate for education, land rights, and protection from forced displacement, often doing so from within the folds of conservative communities. These women don't shout to be heard. They negotiate, write, organize, and sometimes simply refuse to be silent. A whisper, after all, can echo just as far as a scream, especially when carried by the desert wind. And then there are the Tuareg women, veiled not in fabric but in poetry. Often referred to as the blue people of the Sahara for their indigo-dyed clothing, the Tuareg are matrilineal, and their women compose and recite tender poems of love, protest, and everyday life. These verses, passed from mother to daughter, are sung into the night like lullabies with teeth. In the stillness of sand and shadow, these poets preserve memory, rebellion, and beauty, written not just on paper, but in air and rhythm. Education in nomadic regions isn't just about chalkboards and exams. It's about transmission of skills, of wisdom, of survival itself. For desert women, gaining formal education often means confronting a cascade of obstacles: distance, tradition, limited resources, and expectations anchored in older ways. And yet, there's movement, quiet but persistent. Women are opening makeshift schools in tents, turning caravans into classrooms, and creating spaces where literacy mingles with ancestral knowledge. Leadership, too, looks different beneath a desert sky. It's often less about position and more about presence. Women guide communities as midwives, healers, negotiators, and storytellers. In places where mobility is constant and resources scarce, leadership becomes an act of caretaking, of knowing when to move, whom to trust, and how to preserve dignity with very little to spare. These leaders may not hold office, but they hold the rhythm of the tribe. And sometimes that's the greater power. Balancing tradition with technology in the desert is a bit like trying to charge your phone with a camel, theoretically possible, but you'll need a few clever workarounds. Satellite dishes peek out from goat hair tents. Solar panels gleam beside centuries-old wells. And somewhere, a grandmother who once wove tents by hand is now showing her granddaughter how to use WhatsApp to barter for spices 3 towns away. Desert women have become fluent in both the ancient and the algorithmic. They live-stream henna ceremonies, use mobile apps to track grazing patterns, and sell handmade goods to global buyers all while observing rituals that predate electricity. They are adapting, not abandoning. In their hands, a smartphone is just another tool like a spindle or a cooking pot. It's not about choosing between past and future. It's about syncing both, like layers in a song that still keeps time with the wind. From signal towers to sewing circles, the desert hums with change yet, as more families trade tents for towns. The rhythm of nomadic life must learn to echo through concrete walls. As cities stretch their fingers into the sand, the pull between mobility and permanence grows stronger. Nomadic traditions, once passed down beside campfires, now navigate apartment balconies and digital screens, clinging to memory in a world tilting towards cement. The shift from tents to towns wasn't just about architecture. It marked a profound transformation in the rhythm of life, especially for desert women. In nomadic societies, daily survival was interwoven with movement, pitching tents, tending camels, reading the weather and the wrinkles of the sky. But in urbanized spaces, that ancestral knowledge can begin to fade like footprints in windblown dunes. For some, city life brought access to education, healthcare, and stability. For others, it felt like a soft erosion of identity. Women who once wore their tribal affiliation in indigo-stained veils and handmade jewelry now navigate hybrid identities, part tradition, part touchscreen. Grandmothers whisper stories that once echoed across open sands now into apartment hallways, hoping their granddaughters will listen. The challenge today isn't merely survival, but remembering how survival once looked when the horizon was both home and map. Economic pressures have a way of redefining identity, sometimes gently, like sand reshaping a dune, and sometimes abruptly, like a market crashing through a marketplace. For many desert women, tradition once dictated their role. Now, it's often economics that does. Tourism, textile sales, and handmade goods once offered empowerment and pride, a chance to preserve heritage through commerce. But when mass production sneaks in like a mirage offering cheaper wares, that pride can be priced out of the market. Young women, especially, walk a tightrope between honoring craft and chasing opportunity. Some leave the dunes behind for salaried city jobs, returning home only for festivals or funerals. Others stay and adapt, turning Instagram into a digital souk, selling woven art or desert-infused beauty balms. And in that negotiation between survival and soul is a quiet revolution. It's not always visible, but if you listen closely, you can still hear the echo of old songs beneath the buzz of electric markets. Preserving culture is never a matter of freezing it in time, especially not in a place where time itself rides on camelback and dances with the wind. For desert women, the challenge isn't just holding on to the past, but braiding it into a future that doesn't always speak their language. Oral histories passed down by firelight now compete with screens glowing late into the night. Sacred embroidery patterns, once sewn into dowry linens, are pixelated and printed on mass-produced scarves. Beautiful, yes, but stripped of story. Still, not all is lost in translation. Women are adapting. They digitize old songs, record grandmothers' lullabies, host desert fashion shows that reinterpret tribal patterns with modern flair. Some create archives, others create TikToks, and both, in their own way, are acts of defiance of saying, we are still here, we still remember. Cultural preservation doesn't mean standing still in the sand. It means carrying it with you, even if some of it falls through your fingers along the way. The desert has always demanded adaptability, but climate change has turned up the heat literally and metaphorically. What once was a predictable rhythm of dry and drier has become chaotic. Flash floods tear through old caravan paths, oases shrink, and the wind carries whispers of worry in every language spoken beneath the sun. For women who've spent generations harvesting water from stone and coaxing life from sand, the stakes aren't theoretical, they're ancestral. Cultural survival becomes intertwined with environmental survival. Will the herbs used for healing still grow near the dried-up wadis? Can a nomadic rhythm persist when drought stretches too long, or government restrictions fence off ancient routes? Women, as usual, lead the quiet resistancy, inventing traditional techniques, advocating for sustainable herding, teaching children how to read the stars and the changing skies. It's not just about saving customs, it's about surviving with dignity, with memory intact. The sand shifts, but the spirit holds. In the desert, water is never just water. It's wealth, it's power, it's peace, or the reason peace dissolves. And as climate change tightens its grip, ancient springs run dry, and the old songs about wells are being replaced by the sound of plastic canisters bumping against one another in line. The women who once whispered blessings over cool handfuls now calculate liters and kilometers. Migration, once a seasonal dance with nature, becomes a forced march. Entire communities shift, not in search of greener pastures, but of any pasture at all. And it is often women carrying children, water, memory who are first to move and last to rest. They adapt, as they always have, mapping new routes while keeping the stories of the old ones alive. In every drop they conserve and every border they cross, they carry not only survival but the soul of a place that may no longer exist on any map. While the world debates carbon credits and global summits, many desert women are already quietly doing the work, tending what grows, saving what's left, and passing down knowledge the climate scientists are just catching up on. These women have been composting, conserving, and planting trees long before it became a trending hashtag. From restoring oasis gardens to teaching younger generations how to trap dew or repurpose scraps, they've become stewards of tradition and innovation. Some even lead solar-powered co-ops or reintroduce ancient drought-resistant crops, proving that sustainability isn't a luxury, it's a legacy. Their strength isn't just in surviving the desert's extremes, but in gently coaxing life from its edges. And sometimes, the greenest thumbs are the ones still dusted with sand. In a world scrambling for futuristic solutions, some of the most promising answers are buried in the past under layers of sand and centuries of intuition. Desert women have long known the wisdom of clay pots that cool water without electricity, of shaded courtyards that create their own breeze, of herbal infusions that heal both body and soil. These aren't relics, they're blueprints. Today, there's a gentle revival underway. Younger generations are turning back to their grandmother's methods not out of nostalgia, but necessity. Ancient water harvesting systems, traditional seed saving, and zero-waste cooking are making a comeback, not just in villages, but in TED Talks and university research. And desert women? They never stopped doing it. Turns out, resilience was always handmade, sun-dried, and passed down quietly at dusk. As the world grows louder and faster, a quiet turning inward has begun, especially among women tracing the soft outlines of their lineage in the sand. In desert communities and beyond, there's a rekindling of old spiritual rhythms, not as a retreat from modernity, but as a recalibration. Women are gathering under moonlight once more, not just for ritual, but for restoration. The desert has always whispered truths that were more felt than spoken. Now, those whispers are finding voice again in sacred circles, in reclaimed rites of passage, in the honoring of intuition, once dismissed as superstition. Herbal wisdom, lunar observance, storytelling. As prayer, these are no longer fringe but frontier, and it is women, many of them descendants of sand and sun, who are leading the way back to embodied reverence. Not a return, but a remembering. In a world untethered from the sky, many women are reaching back gently, deliberately to the cycles that once guided every harvest, healing, and hush. The moon, once a timekeeper for both womb and world, is no longer just poeticits practical again. Calendars of soil and skin are being redrawn, not in spreadsheets but in crescent moons and solstice shadows. From the dunes of North Africa to urban gardens in New York, earth-based rituals are no longer relics of the past. They're part of a quiet revolution. Women plant seeds by moonlight, gather herbs by instinct, and chart their days not by deadlines but by phases. It isn't a longing for fantasy, it's a yearning for rhythm. In these practices, spiritual revival is not performance, but pulse. In the desert, where silence speaks louder than sound, mysticism has always offered a mirror for feminine identity. It's not about smoke and spectacle, but something deeper, knowing that rests in the bones and stirs when the wind shifts. Women have long been the desert's quiet mystics, reading stars instead of scrolls, and finding truth not in doctrine but in dust. Across centuries, they embodied paradox, veiled yet powerful, still yet in motion, hidden yet guiding. Whether through dream interpretation, herbal alchemy, or trance-inducing chants, desert women shaped spiritual paths with tenderness and precision. Their mysticism wasn't escapism, it was survival. And in reclaiming those practices today, modern seekers aren't just playing dress-up in ancient robes, they're returning to a lineage of grounded magic where intuition is honored and the sacred is stitched into every step across the sand. In a world racing to overload, desert retreats have emerged as the newest quiet luxury. From the Moroccan dunes to the Australian outback, women in Manar traveling long distances for one thing: stillness. It turns out, when the horizon stretches uninterrupted, even your thoughts can learn to stretch too. These aren't your typical retreats. They blend ancient desert wisdom with modern mindfulness. Morning tea woven with native herbs, afternoon journaling under tent shadows, evenings spent tracing star constellations while listening to desert hymns. Women-led circles offer space to breathe, to remember, to reclaim parts of the spirit that buzz with city noise. And it's not just tourists showing up. Local desert women are teaching these retreats, guiding rituals, and holding councils. They ask questions like, what if silence was not absence, but presence? What if rest was resistance? Through these stillness practices, desert mysticism is finding a new audience, and feminine wisdom is stepping quietly into global conversation. Across centuries and shifting sands, the desert daughters have left footprints not easily erased. From firelit poetry and sacred wells to market stalls and matriarchal thrones, these women have shaped survival into a kind of art. Their stories speak not of fragility, but of strength carved in silence. They wove homes from cloth, spun wisdom into lullabies, healed with hands calloused by both labor and prayer. Whether roaming caravans or holding ground through upheaval, they carried culture, continuity, and quiet defiance beneath their veils and jewelry. And still, they remain, not just in history books or ancient ballads, but in the revival of rituals, the rise of climate stewards, the unbroken songs whispered between generations. The desert, so often seen as barren, has always been full of women, of life, of memory. So now, as the world quiets and the night deepens, rest in their legacy. Let the hush of ancient sands soothe your breath. Imagine the soft flicker of firelight on tent walls. Hear the echo of stories told in the dark, meant to comfort, meant to carry. Sleep now, cradled in the stillness they mastered. You're not alone in the night. And so, as the stories of desert women settle like twilight over dunes, let us turn our gaze outward to the land itself. For the desert is not just backdrop, but character, not just setting, but storyteller. And if you listen closely, you'll find she has her own truths to share. The desert is often mistaken for silence, but those who listen closely know better. Beneath the winds and woven shadows lies a landscape humming with secrets not loud, but insistent. The grains underfoot? Ancient, wind-sculpted time travelers. The heat? A lesson in endurance, not cruelty. Take, for instance, the Sahara. She stretches wider than the United States and shifts daily not just in temperature, but in shape. Her dunes migrate with the wind, inching across the map like slow, sleeping giants. Some of her sands were once lush seabeds, full of life now pressed into fossils that whisper of fish where there are no rivers. Temperatures swing wildly here. Daylight can sear at 120 degrees 49 degrees cents, but after dusk, the same ground may cradle frost. The desert doesn't warm gradually or cool politely. It demands your full attention and your full respect. And then there's water scarce, yes, but never absent. Ancient aquifers run like buried veins beneath the sand. In places like the Nubian desert, wells tap into water thousands of years old. This isn't just hydration, it's time travel. Each drop a relic, a reminder that patience and persistence are sometimes the same thing. Plants here are not delicate. They hoard water like misers, bloom with flair when it rains, then vanish underground, waiting. The resurrection plant curls into a dry ball and can spring back to green life with just a few drops, proof that rest is not always death. Animals too have mastered survival without complaint. The fennec fox cools itself through its oversized ears. Camels recycle their own moisture, sipping from fat stores and blinking through sandstorms with lashes that would make any mascara company envious. Nothing here is accidental. Everything is engineered for resilience. Even the light behaves differently in the desert, bending and shimmering into mirages that trick the eye and tease the senses. A lake on the horizon, just sunlight and longing, dancing together for the 1,000th time. The desert does not shout to be heard. She waits for quiet minds, for those who move slowly, and if you lean in, really lean in, you might find that the stillest places speak the loudest. From the quiet strength of desert women to the curious magic of the land they walk, the story continues. Let us now wander into the desert itself, not as scientists or tourists, but as curious souls tracing the unexpected marvels tucked into its silence. The desert, contrary to its barren reputation, is a place of sly abundance. Take the sand, for instance, grains shaped by wind over millions of years, each one holding stories older than cities. Some deserts hum with singing sands, where dunes vibrate and produce low, haunting tones when disturbed. It's not a ghost, it's physics, but you can be forgiven for confusing the two. Desert nights? Freezing. Despite the sun's brashness by day, the heat escapes into the open sky once it sets. Bedouin wisdom tells you to dress in layers, not out of fashion, but survival. Meanwhile, a full moon in the desert doesn't just illuminate, it exaggerates, casting shadows sharp enough to feel like memory. And then there are the oases, not just romantic punctuation in camel tales, but thriving ecosystems often hiding deep underground rivers. The Siwa Oasis in Egypt, for example, has sustained human life for millennia, its salt lakes glowing turquoise like an illusion that turns out to be real. Here, date palms rise from the dust like green prayers answered. Camels, of course, are the original all-terrain vehicles, but they're also deeply misunderstood. Their humps don't store water, they store fat, which the body converts as needed. They can drink over 25 gallons of water in one sitting and go for weeks without another drop. And those eyelashes, nature's sunglasses, evolution gave them a wardrobe change. Some deserts even see snow. The Sahara, on rare occasions, dons a white veil brief, astonishing, and gone by mid-morning, as if the sky herself forgets for a moment where she is. You might also be surprised to find bioluminescent beetles, tiny frogs hiding in dry riverbeds, or desert plants like the resurrection fern, which appears dead for months, then unfurls green after a single rain. Survival here isn't a gimmick, it's a philosophy. And beneath it all, silence, not the absence of sound, but a fullness. A hush so complete it can be a little terrifying if you're used to constant noise. But let it in, and you might discover the most curious desert phenomenon of all, the one that's felt rather than seen, a kind of remembering, a tuning fork to your own stillness. So if you lie back now and close your eyes, imagine that ancient hush. Let your thoughts wander with the wind. Let your breath mimic the slow rise and fall of dunes. You are here, wrapped in stories, science, and sand. And sleep? It's just another kind of mirajuan you're allowed to follow now. Sleep well, desert dreamer. The stars are watching and the sands remember.